I can talk about any issue in 25 words or less.
Why, yes, you can. And yet there can be so much more to say, especially when you're breaking down 15 issues that are shaping the future of state and local government. And we're doing just that on this episode of the podcast with the editorial crew of Governing. That's coming up.
TFIC takes you deeper into the stories that are shaping the future of state and local government.
To boldly go where no man has gone before.
You're not Buzz Lightyear.
I'm Siri.
And I'm Google.
And I am Alexa.
Alexa seems so smart, I think we'd have a lot to talk about.
Pew, pew.
From Governing and Government Technology, this is The Future in Context with Paul Taylor, and I'm Ashley Silver.
Ashley, this time out, we will begin a two-part discussion of the issues to watch in 2024 with the help of the writers and editors of Governing. It covers most of the alphabet, from AI to workforce. And also in this episode, a look ahead at the year in budgets, taxes, poverty, fentanyl, and crime.
To do that, we've invited the staff writers of Governing, Zena Hutton, Carl Smith, Jared Bray, along with Governing's newly named editor, Alan Greenblatt, to help us understand what to watch and why.
So Yogi Berra is famous for, among other things, saying that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Why do we do it, Alan? And why are they perennial reader favorites?
Well, every year we do this package of issues to watch stories. I think people are interested in not just its predictive value, but sort of as a snapshot of where we are. A lot of what we're saying is summing up what happened in the prior year. We are trying to look forward to suggest what's going to be happening and where. But, so many people aren't keeping up, professionally anyway, with all the issues or all the activity in all the states. I mean, that's the broader perspective that we're trying to lend. Even if you're a resident of one state, you may not be aware of what's happening in 49 other states. And if you're tracking an issue, whether it's AI or abortion or state finances or what have you, it's useful to have a summary saying, oh, right, all of this is happening with crime or with housing or with all these other issues as well, just so you have a general sense of the panoply of issues that state legislators are thinking about.
You've helped curate this list for a good many years. Does this year's list look different than others, or how is it different from others?
Well, every year is a little bit different. The times change. We've come out of a few years where the pandemic was such a huge concern. Now, as a policy concern, it seems to have faded away. And I think a lot of people have put it out of their minds as individuals as well. I was really struck. I attended the, not to name drop, but I went to the National Association of Counties annual meeting a few months ago. And it wasn't until the last day that I heard the word COVID, whereas a year or two before it would have been so dominant. And that is reflected in a lot of the other issues we're writing about, in that the federal government has sent so much money to the states in response to COVID and the economic shock that it presented, at least at first. That money is now drying up, more or less. And a lot of the different sort of policy issues that we're addressing were shaped or reshaped by the pandemic. Certain trends that were happening were accelerated or exacerbated, whether it's homelessness or crime. There does seem to have been an effect from the pandemic in a lot of different areas. I guess there's a debate sometimes about how much, whether the uptick in murders in 20 and 2021 were driven by the pandemic. But anyway, times do change. And this year, sort of oddly, to me, it feels like almost a return to normal, because these huge macro effects are waning, and inflation seems to be coming down. I mean, it seems as the year begins, I know these are words I'll eat at the end of the year, but as the year begins, it seems like a fairly stable, calm kind of year. But yeah, I'm sure drama is around the corner.
Return to normal. How do you sell newspapers with a headline like that? There were two little letters that broke the internet last year, and they'll have some effects moving forward. Let's talk about AI with Zena.
Zena, I did get the chance to read a very insightful piece you created focused on a real hotbed topic this year. Of course, Paul mentioned it, artificial intelligence, right? So we know there has been quite a bit of movement pertaining to policies involving AI in the last few months. And for example, I actually spoke to a CIO in North Carolina last week, and he told me they don't consider the new standards they're forming in regard to AI to be policies, quote unquote, but instead they refer to them as an AI framework because it's ever evolving, constantly changing every day. So, with that, can you tell us how you've seen policy surrounding AI evolve this year and in what ways?
So far, what I've been seeing are a lot of people, a lot of potential legislation get proposed around how we're using AI, not just in the policy making sphere, but also broadly building it out at the state level. What we're seeing are kind of bans of things like deep fakes around, damaging content specifically to individuals, and that is kind of an increasing wave. We're seeing states like California and New York, and I think Connecticut put together privacy concerns. That's kind of how they're doing a lot of their policy, through privacy concerns, and bias. California is actually really big on the bias front, focusing on kind of legislating what you're allowed to collect about people and how you're allowed to use that information when it comes to ethnicity, gender, anything that can be counted as like a marginalization, especially in terms of like healthcare and applying to jobs. So that's really what we're seeing in terms of like the development of policy. Framework is a really good word to talk about it, but we're really seeing a lot of people kind of be very rigid, in a way that a framework wouldn't necessarily cover.
And you mentioned the workforce, which I know we'll talk about a little down the line as well. But particularly the word that interests me is hiring, because I had read and done a story on like different hiring bills related to AI, where they have to let the applicant know what they're using AI for, how that's going into hiring processes. Have you spoken to any sources that have shared their thoughts on how AI will impact the workforce?
I spoke to Kara Woodson Welch from Public Sector HR, and one of the things we talked about actually was the initial usage of AI in that process, and how they're keeping an eye on how it can be developed, because it's very easy to just not account for what's built into these systems, because AI, it's born of human biases. They're scraping the internet. The rules that go into developing AI also come from positions of bias. And so when you apply that out to hiring, especially in the public sector, people can get left behind or left out. And so, they're already looking at how to make sure people aren't getting ejected from the process because of their of potentially unfair systems within the AI.
And with all that you've shared with us today and all that you've seen in AI policy progression this year, how do you foresee the future of AI in government IT and legislation?
I think we're going to see many more attempts to regulate it, especially, going into the election year. You're going to see more legislation get proposed that will handle or attempt to handle deep fakes and the generation of images, videos, and text around election candidates at every level, especially because we're at a point where a lot of the generated images are pretty good. Like, you're seeing people have difficulty, especially older people who maybe don't have image literacy, data literacy, seeing them struggle with recognizing faked images. And so you're going to see more of a push to maybe start forming data literacy around AI. You're going to see regulation around disclosure around what can be done with AI for campaign materials, especially maybe attack ads or quotes. And you're also just going to see people mess up. That, I think, is actually going to be a key thing with AI in public sphere next year, we're going to see a lot of people messing up, either in their usage or how they talk about it.
Zena, just a follow-on question. You properly noted that people will mess up in this space, but AI is capable of hallucinations itself. Are the frameworks that you're reading addressing hallucinations?
Some of them are, but I don't think it's enough because a lot of the people putting together these frameworks, yes, they're working with CIOs, but they're also kind of not thinking about the different ways that AI can hallucinate. So they may account for some aspects, but there's no like consistent frame for fact checking, for simply just getting the wrong thing. And it's very difficult, especially when it comes to images, to look at what the hallucination has made, what the AI has hallucinated and analyze it. And so far, we're kind of a little behind from what I've been reading and what I've been keeping track of, a little behind in seeing those hallucinations get addressed directly.
Carl and Jared, let's bring you into the conversation. Earlier, Alan made the bold prediction that this is somehow a return to normal. Carl, are we seeing that on the budget front?
According to the National Association of State Budget Officers, it is a pretty normal year. They're saying they're not hearing a lot of people being worried. Budgets show mild increases, and projections or government spending will be a little bit more next year. Yes, there was pandemic money, but government realized that was a one-time thing and didn't commit to long-term expenditures, but focused the expenditures on one-time things or maybe a little bit of a administrative or whatever infrastructure thing, so that they didn't make long-term commitments on money that they knew wouldn't be there.
Are you suggesting the government can be a learning organization?
Well, let's all hope so, yes, I am.
Jared, budgets are made possible by taxes, and I know that you've been doing some work in this space. There's this tension between raising revenue for new and expanded programs, and then on the other hand, a drive for tax cuts on the other. How is that working itself out?
An interesting thing that's been happening in the tax space is that, because of the pandemic relief funds, a lot of the federal funds were predicated on like states aren't allowed to use it to, and cities aren't allowed to use it to just cut taxes. But a lot of them ended up with surpluses because so many people had extra money. And so because they had sort of budget surpluses at the end of the past few years, they did choose to cut income and corporate taxes. Something like 25 states have done that in the last few years. So it's going to be interesting to see how those decisions sort of play out in the next few years, because a lot of people say that the surpluses were built on sort of temporary factors, and the tax cuts could have longer lasting impacts.
Good, and I should underscore, I was talking about enacted budgets for fiscal year 2024. Those are not up in the air. Those are with money in hand, and those do represent what has been characterized as a bit of a return to normal, and they're not seeing shortfalls, and they're rich rainy day funds. A lot of things could happen before they start making 2025 budgets, that's for sure.
The old Blockbuster model used to be profit through late fees. And Jared, you cover transit and transportation and all those good things. Many communities are having a devil of time paying for those. Taxes and fees, how do you see them playing out in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things happening with that is that a couple places, most notably Massachusetts, has sort of adopted and is looking to enact a tax on the highest income earners. It's sort of one of those areas that the left tries to turn to every once in a while, so sort of like increase taxes on the wealthiest people to fund public services. And in Massachusetts, they're doing a tax on people whose incomes are over $1 million and hoping to give the money back to public schools and public transit. And so I think you're going to see sort of, especially if budgets do get tighter in the next coming years, folks looking to sort of like raise those types of taxes and dedicate those funds to things that are seen as sort of public goods.
You mentioned the million and above club. Ashley, I think, has some questions for you about the other end of the economic spectrum.
So, Jared, I read that 6 states have created new child tax credits, including New Jersey, New Mexico, Vermont, Minnesota, Oregon, and Utah. And some other states have expanded existing credits to kind of ease the void left with the expiration of certain federal programs. So, can you speak to what you've learned this year in regard to states kind of working to fill that void?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the sort of expansion of the federal child tax credit during the pandemic, and the federal child tax credit, from what I've sort of learned and spoken with folks about, is a powerful sort of credit for helping families with children, but that it has really a lot of a set of really complicated eligibility criteria and things like that. And during the pandemic, the federal government essentially waived a lot of those criteria. And so it made the federal tax credit much simpler and much more effective. So people were sort of assumed to be qualifying unless they were like, actual really high income families. Um, and it had all these, the research on it showed all these like almost immediate impacts on the way people spent money on food and healthcare and some of the most basic things they do for you do for kids. Um, that expansion got rolled back, but a lot of states were sort of inspired by that to sort of create tax credits of their own that would do something similar. And so, like you said, there's a bunch that are new. I think right now there's something like 14 states that have their own child tax credits on the books, and there's another 10 or a dozen or so that are actively considering it. So, one of my sources was telling me it's possible that in the next few years we could have something like half the states in the nation with child tax credits of their own, and then that's going to sort of the research that comes out of that could sort of build the case for all types of future policy work. Another sort of plank of policy that folks are working on around poverty is paid leave. States are doing this. Cities have tried to sort of pass their own versions of paid leave policies for a while, and they're passed at sort of varying levels of robustness. What the research from Europe has showed is that uh, they don't start having negative impacts on workforce participation until they're so generous that you let people have more than a year or so of paid leave. Then sort of people sort of start sort of you actually see sort of like employment reductions based on those types of policies. But a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in the U.S., giving people sort of a few months either for childbirth or caring for an elderly adult or another family member is in the shorter range, and it seems like there's a lot of sort of positive economic benefits that are accompanied with that.
Do you think the paid leave and things like the child tax credits will kind of funnel over into the years to come, or do you see it as something that's going to be like a prolonged way to help poverty?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you'll see more states do it. There's a bunch that are sort of actively considering it now. Some of the folks who sort of research this stuff also say that the federal government really has a lot of power to sort of set the table for this kind of stuff too. It's like obviously states were inspired by what happened during the pandemic, but also states are in competition with each other around so many different types of things, and the more that federal policy can sort of set a baseline, the easier it is for states to sort of adjust their own tax policies and social safety net policies to better serve their workforces, and not having to sort of like start from scratch to offer these types of benefits to people. Another thing that I think is interesting and worth noting around poverty, it's sort of a small time thing right now, but there's some cities, including Philadelphia and Harris County, which is where Houston is, that are experimenting with guaranteed basic income, which is a sort of an idea of just basically giving people cash to try to cover some of the most basic needs. And it's a controversial idea, sort of, but it's had an interesting sort of political coalition around it, and you're going to see a couple small pilot programs where low income families are going to be given sort of a monthly stipend, and they're going to jurisdictions are going to sort of research how they spend that money and what kind of benefit it has.
So, Alan, I was reading one of your articles from earlier this year, and the deck or subhead, as some might call it, really struck me. And it said everything from fatal overdoses to the number of people suffering from depression is growing at alarming rates. And although counties have been providing services, they're insisting that Washington do more. So, have you found that that has been a pretty blanket concern for county officials dealing with increased drug use from substances like fentanyl in your findings? And can you speak a bit to those concerns?
Well, fentanyl has become a huge issue. There's just so many people dying. About 100,000 Americans die of drug overdoses every year, and about 75,000 of them are from fentanyl. So it's become a major concern both in the public health sphere and public safety and policing more broadly. And it's one of many issues where there's no consensus, where Republicans are wanting more of an enforcement approach. They want to try to cut off supply. It's part of the debate over closing the border more tightly. They want harsher penalties for drug dealers, whereas Democrats, by and large, want a public health approach. They want to help people who have, I guess they call it substance abuse disorder, get treatment, get testing strips to make sure their supplies are safe, and generally taking a medically based approach. But so there's no consensus on this issue, and but it is an issue getting attention from all levels of government.
And have you seen any notable or innovative programs this year to help with this type of public health issue?
I guess I would just point to some of the specific examples of the medical treatment type approach. San Francisco has had a huge problem with drug abuse. They had they were one of the success stories in the early stages of the pandemic, keeping COVID deaths and infections relatively low. And in 2020, San Francisco had more deaths from drug overdoses than from COVID. But they have taken more of this treatment type approach, and they've brought those numbers down. But then again, it slips right into the politics of the issue, where San Francisco is kind of the bête noire of the right, and this is seen as a soft approach, and they're wanting crackdowns on, it's pretty open air drug market type situation in lots of parts of San Francisco. So there hasn't been a perfect solution anywhere, but it's definitely an issue all over the place.
And how do you see, and you spoke about this a bit, but how do you see legislators in the years to come next year, the following years, tackling this from a state and federal level?
I would guess that the momentum right now is on the more punitive approach, that fentanyl is such a concern that we have this general return to tough on crime rhetoric that we saw in the 90s. It's not quite that loud yet or anything like that, but the idea of doing anything that seems to be soft on criminals or on criminal behavior is fallen out of favor, certainly on the Republican side, and it seems like they want to undo some of the criminal justice reform efforts that we've seen over the past 15 years. Fentanyl alone may bring that movement not to a halt, but definitely slow its momentum.
So, Alan, a raft of stolen Kias may have earned a lot of headlines this year in communities all over the country, but there are higher stakes issues at play. What is the state of play for criminal justice reform in 2024?
Well, there's still very active efforts in a lot of areas. I think Illinois got a lot of attention this year for its law on cash bail. In general, the momentum is the other way. It's legislators are looking for ways to signal they're tough on crime with more punitive approaches.
Are those signals more concentrated in a presidential election year?
Well, we're talking about state level activity, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily driven by the presidential race, but I think it will very much be part of the general tenor of the times in 2024. It's looking like Donald Trump will be the nominee for president. He's certainly using very hot rhetoric and talking about crime, but even, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, still running for president, is talking about shooting drug dealers, that kind of thing. So yeah, we're in this lock 'em up, be tough kind of moment again in Republican politics, and it seems like Democrats feel like they're on the defensive on this issue. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, there was a lot of talk about putting curbs on certain police behaviors and tactics and so forth, and that whole issue seems to have gone away. There doesn't seem to be much momentum for anything that appears to be critical of police.
Those are the first 7 issues to watch in 2024 with the help of the writers and editors of Governing.
But wait, there's more. The conversation continues next time as we put more of the immediate future in context. We'll tap the writer's beats to get a read on what to expect in education, public health, mental health, and energy and the environment.
Plus a look ahead at housing, workforce, and the international matters beyond America's borders. That's next time.
New technology is on the horizon, and we're here to guide you through its unfolding story, using insightful discussions that place these evolutions in context. To make sure you stay in the loop, subscribe for free on YouTube or tune in using Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Odyssey, or Audible.
The editorial and production team behind TFIC includes Noel Nell, Ergon Item, Zoe Manzanati, and Kaylee Tedrow. Our editor-in-chief is Kathleen Robinette. And that will do it for us this time around. Next time out, more issues to watch with the editors and writers from Governing. That's next time. For Ashley Silver, I'm Paul Taylor. Thanks for listening. Stay in touch with the show at tfic.tech.